promising young woman, a trusted colleague, and a relationship that spiraled into unthinkable horror. What seemed like an ordinary romance turned into one of the UK's most shocking murders. This is the chilling story of Megan Newborough. Stay with us, because every detail will leave you stunned. In the quiet town of Colville, in Leicestershire, the summer of 2021 seemed like any other. Families enjoyed their evenings in parks, couples strolled through quiet lanes, and the rhythms of daily life carried on without disruption. But beneath this surface of calm, a tragic story was unfolding, one that would soon become headline news across the country. At the center of it was a young woman named Megan Newborough, a 23-year-old who had just begun carving out her life as an independent adult. Megan had recently secured her position as a human resources officer at Ibstock Brick, one of the largest brick manufacturers in the country, and her life seemed full of promise. Friends and colleagues described her as someone with a gentle nature, an empathetic soul, and a bright professional future. She had loving parents and a close-knit family who admired her ambition and cherished her kindness. In the workplace, Megan stood out not just because of her competence but also because of her warmth. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, bridging the gap between management and workers. It was here, in the same company, that she crossed paths with Ross McCullum, a 30-year-old factory worker. On the surface, Ross appeared like many others in the workforce. Hardworking, reliable, and sociable enough to strike up conversations. To Megan, he was simply another colleague, but soon that casual connection would grow into something more personal and ultimately dangerous. The relationship between Megan and Ross began quietly, almost tentatively. For Megan, it seemed like the beginning of a normal romance. She was young, open to new experiences, and willing to trust. Ross, however, carried beneath his outward demeanor a far more volatile personality. Friends who later spoke about him described a man prone to insecurity, jealousy, and erratic behavior. His mood could shift quickly, and while he could appear charming at times, there was always something unpredictable simmering just beneath the surface. Yet at first, Megan didn't see this darkness. To her, he was simply someone she was getting to know. Over the weeks, their relationship deepened, though not without signs of unease. Ross seemed controlling, needy, and more intense than Megan expected. Still, she gave him the benefit of the doubt. She was, after all, a kind-hearted person, one who believed in patience and in understanding others. To her family, she may have mentioned Ross only casually, not yet seeing the red flags that, in hindsight, would seem glaring. The connection was brief but enough to tie her to Ross in a way that would prove irreversible. By early August, Megan agreed to spend an evening with Ross at his home in Colville. It was a simple arrangement, the kind many couples made during the early stages of a relationship. Megan likely saw it as an opportunity to spend some quiet time together, to learn more about him away from the workplace. But what began as a casual evening soon turned sinister. That night, behind the walls of Ross's home, tensions rose. The details of exactly what sparked the violence remain partly obscured, but the outcome was tragically clear. Ross turned on Megan with unimaginable brutality. In a sudden act of rage, he strangled her, cutting off her breath and silencing her in moments of sheer terror. But the violence did not stop there. In a frenzied assault, he took a knife and slashed her throat 14 times. The excessive nature of the attack shocked investigators and later the jury. It was not a momentary loss of control, but an eruption of violence that revealed deep anger and instability. For Ross, panic quickly followed. He had crossed a line that could never be undone, and now he faced the reality of what he had done. Instead of calling for help or admitting to his crime, he chose deception. He placed Megan's body into his vehicle, determined to distance himself from the evidence of his actions. Driving into rural Leicestershire, he eventually dumped her body in a remote location near Charlie Road, close to Woodhouse Eaves. It was a place of quiet countryside, far from the eyes of neighbors or passers-by, and he hoped the isolation would conceal his crime. But Ross did more than hide her body. He tried to manipulate the digital traces Megan left behind. Using her phone, he sent messages designed to create the illusion that she was still alive, attempting to buy himself time and divert suspicion. These efforts, however, only painted a darker picture of his mindset. Instead of remorse, there was calculation. Instead of regret, there was strategy. It revealed a man unwilling to accept responsibility, even in the face of the irreversible. Meanwhile, Megan's family grew concerned when she did not return home. It was entirely unlike her to go silent, to cut off communication without explanation. The hours turned into worry, and soon the worry became alarm. Her parents reported her missing, sparking an immediate investigation. For them, it was the beginning of a nightmare, one that would unfold piece by painful piece. When police began tracing Megan's last known movements, all signs pointed back to Ross. He was the last person to see her alive, the one who had been in contact with her that night. The messages sent from her phone only deepened suspicion, as their tone did not match the Megan her family and friends knew so well. When Ross was questioned, his story began to unravel under the weight of evidence. Forensic examinations, digital data, and inconsistencies in his account all closed in around him, making clear what he had done. The discovery of Megan's body confirmed the worst fears of her loved ones. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators. Strangulation alone was horrific, but the repeated slashing of her throat left no doubt about the ferocity of Ross's actions. It was not just murder. It was a crime of overwhelming violence, carried out against a young woman whose only mistake had been placing her trust in the wrong person. As the investigation progressed, Megan's character stood in stark contrast to the man who had killed her. She was remembered by her family as a beautiful, caring soul, someone who had so much more to give the world. Her loss rippled outward, devastating those closest to her and haunting a community that could not fathom such cruelty occurring in their midst. Colville, a place rarely touched by headlines of this nature, was now marked by one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory. Part 1 of the story ends not with resolution but with questions. Why did Ross unleash such violence on someone who had done nothing but care for him? What darkness inside him could drive such an act? And how would the justice system confront a crime so brutal, committed not by a stranger in the shadows, but by a man trusted enough to be invited into Megan's life? The hours after Megan Newborough's disappearance were a blur of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions for her family. What began as simple concern quickly escalated into dread when phone calls went unanswered and messages remained unread. Megan was not the type of person to suddenly vanish or leave her family worrying. She was dependable, considerate, and deeply connected to her loved ones. Her parents and sister knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. When she was officially reported missing, Leicestershire police mobilized quickly, aware that time is crucial in such cases. Officers began tracing her movements, combing through CCTV footage, mobile phone data, and witness accounts to piece together her last known steps. Every lead pointed back to one man, Ross McCullum. Ross had been the last person to see Megan alive, and he became the immediate focus of the investigation. Detectives contacted him and began asking questions about the evening of August 6th. His responses seemed rehearsed, vague, and contradictory. He insisted Megan had left his home alive, yet his behavior suggested he was hiding something. Police were already aware of messages sent from Megan's phone after she was last seen, but those texts raised suspicion rather than easing fears. The language was uncharacteristic of her, as though someone else had been writing them. Family members confirmed this instinctively. Megan's voice was missing from those words. While detectives pressed Ross for details, search teams fanned out into rural Leicestershire. The investigation took them to Woodhouse Eaves, a village known for its quiet countryside and winding roads. It was here, off Charlie Road, that the grim discovery was made. Hidden away from public view, Megan's body was found. The scene confirmed what many feared. She had been murdered with shocking violence. The brutality of the wounds, her throat slashed multiple times after she had already been strangled, was evidence of an uncontrollable rage. The excessive nature of the attack stunned officers who had seen many forms of crime. This was not a single strike of impulse. It was prolonged, frenzied, and deeply personal. News of the discovery rippled through the community. Colville, with its tight-knit neighborhoods, had never witnessed a case so horrific. Local residents who had known Megan described her as warm, ambitious, and genuine, someone who brought kindness into every interaction. That such a life could be ended so cruelly left many in disbelief. Vigils began to form, and flowers were laid in her memory. The Newborough family, devastated, tried to grasp the reality that their daughter was gone forever. Their grief was magnified by the knowledge that the man responsible had once been trusted, welcomed into Megan's life as a partner. Ross was arrested soon after the discovery. Confronted with the evidence against him, CCTV footage of his movements, forensic traces linking him to the body, and the suspicious messages sent from Megan's phone, he had no escape from the truth. Yet in interviews, he attempted to weave a narrative that cast his actions as panic rather than premeditation. He admitted to killing Megan but claimed it was not planned. According to Ross, he had been overwhelmed, acting in a state of sudden emotional turmoil. He insisted that he had not intended to take her life, though the evidence painted a very different picture. The prosecution began preparing their case with methodical precision. They highlighted the brutality of the attack, the repeated slashing of Megan's throat long after she had already been subdued. They argued this was not the act of someone who simply lost control but the deliberate violence of a man consumed by rage. Evidence showed Ross had attempted to cover his tracks, sending texts from Megan's phone and driving her body into the countryside. These were not the actions of someone paralyzed by shock. They were calculated moves to evade responsibility. The trial revealed disturbing details about Ross's personality. Witnesses described him as insecure and controlling, prone to bursts of anger when he felt slighted. Experts suggested that his relationship with Megan had triggered feelings of inadequacy, and when she perhaps tried to assert boundaries, his fragile ego could not withstand it. In the courtroom, Ross maintained his claims of panic, but the jury heard the chilling details of the attack. The strangulation, the multiple knife wounds, the disposal of her body. The scale of violence contradicted his attempts to minimize his responsibility. For Megan's family, the trial was a tormenting process. They listened as the final moments of their daughter's life were reconstructed in excruciating detail. Every forensic report, every photograph, every word from the prosecution was another reminder of what had been taken from them. They described Megan as a beautiful, caring soul who had so much to offer the world, someone who should have had decades ahead of her to pursue her dreams, build a career, and start a family of her own. The tragedy of her death was not only in the manner of it, but in the endless possibilities now erased. Community members rallied around the Newboroughs. Vigils, fundraisers, and public displays of support became common as people sought ways to show solidarity. The case struck a chord with women across the UK, many of whom saw in Megan's story a chilling reminder of the dangers faced in relationships where red flags are ignored or unseen. Discussions about coercive control, domestic abuse, and toxic relationships surged in the media, with campaigners urging greater awareness and better protections for vulnerable individuals. The trial itself became a spotlight event, reported widely by national news outlets. Courtrooms were filled with journalists documenting every revelation. The question of motive lingered heavily over the proceedings. Why had Ross killed Megan with such ferocity? The prosecution painted a portrait of a man whose insecurities and violent tendencies erupted in deadly rage. The defense tried to soften this image, suggesting that his mental state was fragile, that he had been overwhelmed and incapable of rational judgment in that moment. But the sheer extent of the violence told its own story. When the jury finally returned their verdict, it was clear. Ross McCullum was found guilty of murdering Megan Newborough. The conviction brought a measure of justice, though no sentence could undo the devastation he had caused. As the judge delivered his words, Ross sat emotionless, while Megan's family wept quietly in the gallery. The court acknowledged not only the cruelty of the crime, but also the calculated efforts to disguise it, emphasizing the chilling lack of remorse Ross had shown in the aftermath. For Megan's parents and sister, the verdict was a small step toward closure, though the wound of their loss would never fully heal. They had endured weeks of anguish, from the moment Megan went missing to the horrifying discovery of her body and the painful details laid bare in court. The conviction at least ensured that Ross would face the consequences of his actions, confined to a prison cell, unable to harm anyone else. Yet justice, though delivered, did not ease the broader questions raised by the case. How had such violence been allowed to take root? What signs had been missed in the early stages of Megan's relationship with Ross? And how could society better protect young women from similar fates? These questions lingered, echoing far beyond the courtroom, resonating with families, campaigners, and communities across the country. Part 2 of this story closes with justice delivered but hearts still broken. The trial had ended, the verdict had been given, but the story of Megan Newborough was far from over. Her memory would live on, not only in the love of her family, but in the conversations her death inspired about the hidden dangers of coercive control, the importance of awareness, and the devastating consequences of ignoring warning signs. The trial of Ross McCullum had ended with a guilty verdict, but for the Newborough family, the conclusion of legal proceedings was not the end of their ordeal. Instead, it was the beginning of life after the unimaginable. A life defined by absence, memory, and the constant ache of questions that would never find answers. Megan's parents and sister were forced to face each day knowing their beloved daughter and sibling was taken from them in the most brutal way possible. For them, the justice system could only ever provide partial solace. A conviction could punish the man responsible, but it could not restore what had been lost. In the days following the verdict, Megan's family spoke publicly, offering words that resonated far beyond Leicestershire. They described her as a young woman with dreams, ambitions, and a heart full of kindness. She had only just begun her career in human resources and had so much more to achieve. Her death was not just the loss of a life. It was the silencing of potential, the destruction of futures that could never now unfold. Her family's grief was raw, but their determination to honor Megan was equally clear. They spoke of ensuring her memory would not fade, that her story would stand as both a warning and a legacy. The community responded in kind. Vigils were held, candles lit, and flowers laid in her memory. Local organizations began conversations about safety, relationships, and recognizing signs of coercive control. Megan's story became part of a larger dialogue across the United Kingdom about violence against women, particularly violence within relationships that may appear normal at first glance but conceal dangerous dynamics. Campaigners pointed to Megan's case as a reminder that these crimes are not confined to dark alleys or encounters with strangers. Often, they occur in places of trust, in the company of someone known, even loved. Media coverage extended this conversation, with national outlets dedicating extensive reporting to the trial and its aftermath. Megan's face became familiar to many, her story retold in newspapers, documentaries, and television segments. Her name joined a tragic list of young women whose deaths underscored the urgent need for cultural and institutional change. Campaigners demanded improved education around toxic relationships, better protections for victims, and deeper scrutiny of behaviors that can escalate into violence. Megan's murder was no longer just a personal tragedy. It had become a symbol of a wider social problem. For investigators and prosecutors, the case was one of the most harrowing in recent memory. The brutality of Ross McCullum's actions stood out even in a profession accustomed to violence. Detectives described how the evidence painted a chilling picture of his mindset. The deliberate concealment of Megan's body, the manipulative messages sent from her phone, and the complete absence of remorse. The case was an education in how a seemingly ordinary colleague could mask profound instability and violence, only revealed when it was already too late. In prison, Ross faced a long sentence, though his demeanor remained strikingly cold. Those who saw him in court noted his lack of emotion, as though the weight of what he had done had not penetrated. His conviction ensured he would spend years behind bars, a small measure of safety for society, though it offered little comfort to those left grieving. For Megan's loved ones, his punishment was secondary to the loss itself. No sentence, no matter how long, could ever match the life that had been stolen. Beyond the courtroom, Megan's death inspired a ripple effect of remembrance and advocacy. Friends and colleagues remembered her not as a victim but as the vibrant person she had been, dedicated to her work, kind to those around her, and full of hope for the future. Stories of her laughter, her generosity, and her determination to succeed were shared widely, ensuring she was remembered for more than the circumstances of her death. Memorial services became opportunities not only to grieve but to celebrate the life she had lived, however short. The broader conversation about violence against women gained momentum. Meghan's story was invoked in discussions about reforms to the criminal justice system, the importance of early intervention in abusive relationships, and the responsibilities of employers and communities in recognizing warning signs. Organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse used her case to highlight the need for stronger resources, better training, and more public awareness. Her name became part of campaigns calling for change, a reminder that behind every statistic was a person with a story, a family, and a future. For the people of Colville and Leicestershire, the shadow of the crime lingered. The town, known for its industry and close-knit community, had been thrust into the national spotlight by tragedy. Residents struggled to reconcile the image of their quiet town with the horror that had unfolded in their midst. Yet, in their mourning there was also unity. They stood by the Newborough family, offering support in whatever ways they could, from kind words to collective gestures of remembrance. The tragedy had cut deep, but it had also revealed the strength of community bonds. The final chapter of Meghan's story is not simply one of loss but of legacy. Her family continues to speak about her, ensuring that the world does not forget who she was or what she endured. They channel their grief into awareness, determined that others might be spared similar pain. Their voices join a chorus of families across the country, each with their own stories of loss, each calling for a future where young women can live without fear of violence from those they trust. As time moves forward, the memory of Meghan Newborough endures. In photographs, she is forever 23, her smile radiant, her eyes bright with possibility. Her story is told not only in court transcripts or news articles, but in the hearts of those who loved her, in the lessons her tragedy imparts, and in the continuing struggle for change. The violence that ended her life may have been committed in an instant of rage, but the impact of her death will last for generations. The documentary closes with the image of a young woman who should have had decades ahead of her, a career to flourish, a family to build, dreams to realize. Instead, her story serves as a warning and a call to action. The world was robbed of Meghan's presence, but not of her influence. Through remembrance, advocacy, and change, her life continues to mean something, even after her death. In 2014, Seattle's quiet streets became the hunting ground of a man driven by a chilling mission. For innocent lives were stolen in a cross-country spree fueled by ideology and vengeance. This is the story of Ali Mohammed Brown, the murderer who turned America into his battlefield. In the spring of 2014, the city of Seattle carried on with its usual rhythm, a place alive with coffee shops, bustling neighborhoods, and a sense of community that masked the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Unknown to the people moving through its streets, a man was preparing to strike. His name was Ali Mohammed Brown, a 29-year-old with a criminal past and a growing darkness inside him. For years, he had struggled with brushes against the law, past convictions, and an inability to find stability. But by 2014, something in him had shifted. His violence was no longer random or opportunistic. He had assigned it meaning and ideology. He convinced himself that every life he took was a form of revenge for U.S. foreign policy, for the deaths of innocents abroad, and for a war he felt was unjust. To him, Seattle would be the starting ground of a mission that he alone had chosen. On April 27th, in the quiet suburb of Skyway, that mission claimed its first victim. The night was calm, the streets nearly deserted, when 30-year-old Leroy Henderson crossed paths with Brown. Leroy was known as a kind man, hard-working, with a circle of friends who described him as reliable and decent. He was not wealthy, not someone in the public eye, but he mattered deeply to those who loved him. That night, without realizing the danger he was walking into, he was lured into a wooded area. There, beneath the cover of darkness, the silence was shattered by gunfire. Brown pulled the trigger multiple times, leaving Leroy lifeless in the dirt. For detectives, the murder was troubling but not yet alarming. Seattle had seen violence before, and in its earliest stages, Henderson's death seemed like it could be a targeted dispute or an isolated incident. But what investigators could not see was the methodical calculation behind it. Brown later admitted that this first killing was his test, the opening act of something much larger. He wanted to know if he could do it, if he could take a life in cold blood and walk away. Once he proved it to himself, there would be no stopping. In the weeks that followed, Brown moved through the city like a shadow. He did not draw attention to himself, and outwardly, nothing tied him to the Henderson murder. But inside his own mind, he was already justifying what he had done. He saw the act not as murder, but as warfare. He believed he had drawn blood for a cause bigger than himself, a distorted sense of mission that twisted his anger into a personal declaration of jihad. Seattle, meanwhile, carried on. The city's nightlife thrived, with clubs and bars alive on summer evenings. For young people, the season was a time of freedom, of connection, of building futures. Among them were Dwayne Anderson Young, just 23, and Ahmed Said, 27, close friends who moved through life with openness and pride. Dwayne had recently graduated from college, his energy and charisma pulling people toward him. Ahmed was loyal, funny, and deeply valued in his circle. Both men were openly gay, part of Seattle's vibrant LGBTQ+ community, and unafraid to be themselves. On June 1st, they went out together, unaware that their night would make them targets. Brown had already set his sights on them. He used an online dating app to lure them in, posing as someone they might trust. To him, they were not human beings with futures, but pieces of his twisted agenda. The city that had once been their playground would become the backdrop to their final moments. When the night wound down and the two left the club, they agreed to meet with the stranger who had contacted them. They believed they were simply going to share company, maybe a late-night ride. Instead, they walked straight into an execution. Inside the car, the betrayal was swift and merciless. Brown pulled a gun and opened fire, shooting both men. Dwayne and Ahmed never had a chance to defend themselves. Their lives ended there, in the heart of Seattle, their voices silenced by a man who believed their deaths were justified. When the gunshots faded, Brown fled, leaving behind a scene of horror and grief. The discovery of their bodies sent shockwaves through the city. For friends and family, the loss was unbearable. Dwayne, so full of potential, had been on the edge of beginning his adult life. Ahmed, known for his warmth, was gone without reason. For Seattle's LGBTQ+ community, it was not just murder. It felt like a hate crime, an assault on their existence, a violent reminder of vulnerability. Vigils were held, tears were shed, and the names of Dwayne Anderson Young and Ahmed Said were spoken with reverence and anger. The brutality of their deaths demanded answers. For investigators, the case was no longer a puzzle of isolated violence. Two men killed together, lured in by deception, shot execution style. It had the signs of something colder, something planned. When paired with the Henderson case weeks earlier, a pattern began to form. Detectives started asking if Seattle had a serial killer moving through its neighborhoods, someone targeting men for reasons not yet understood. But at that point, Brown was already gone. What no one realized then was that Brown's war had shifted locations. He had left Washington and crossed the country, slipping away before police could close in. While Seattle mourned its dead and detectives pieced together fragments of evidence, Brown was on the move, looking for his next victim. To him, Seattle had only been the beginning. His twisted ideology demanded more blood, and he would not stop until he was caught. By late June, his journey brought him to New Jersey. For the people of West Orange, the summer nights were ordinary, filled with the hum of traffic and the chatter of young people coming and going. Among them was a 19-year-old college student named Brendan Tevlin. Brendan was intelligent, kind-hearted, and deeply faithful, a young man whose family cherished him. He had just finished a night out with friends, the kind of simple evening that defined youth. He did not know that, by sheer chance, his path was about to cross with a man who had already killed 3 others. On the night of June 25th, Brendan got into his car to head home. He drove through the quiet streets, unaware that Brown was nearby, watching, waiting. To Brown, Brendan represented not an individual but a symbol. He saw him as the embodiment of America, a nation he claimed was guilty of killing innocents overseas. And so, as Brendan stopped at a red light, Brown acted. He approached the car, raised his gun, and fired 10 shots into the young man sitting defenseless behind the wheel. Brendan's life ended instantly, stolen by someone he had never met, for a cause he could never have imagined. When his body was discovered, grief spread like wildfire. Brendan's friends, his family, his community, all were shattered. He was not connected to Brown, not targeted for who he was, but chosen at random to pay the price for decisions made far away, in wars he had no part in. For those who loved him, the senselessness was almost unbearable. Back in Seattle, the realization soon followed. The killer who had taken Henderson, Anderson Young, and said was the same man who had now struck in New Jersey. And for the first time, investigators began to see the scope of the nightmare they were facing. A serial killer motivated not by greed or jealousy or personal revenge, but by ideology. A man who declared war not on individuals but on a country. And until he was found, no one was safe. By the time investigators connected the dots between the murders in Seattle and the brutal killing in New Jersey, Ali Muhammad Brown had already vanished into the shadows of suburban streets and city blocks. For weeks, he had managed to elude capture, slipping from one place to another, leaving behind only questions and devastation. But his crimes had not gone unnoticed, and the weight of his violence was beginning to close in around him. The story of his capture was not only about the work of police, but about communities in shock, families shattered, and a nation trying to understand how one man's self-declared war had spilled blood across the country. Back in Seattle, detectives revisited the cases that had once appeared unconnected. The murder of Leroy Henderson in Skyway, initially treated as an isolated act, now carried new meaning. It was no longer just the loss of a gentle, hard-working man. It was the beginning of a spree. Investigators retraced every step of Brown's life in the days before Henderson's death, seeking any clue that might link him to the crime. Witnesses remembered fragments, faces in passing, cars that didn't seem to belong, fleeting shadows in the night. Each piece was fragile, but slowly, a picture began to emerge. The double homicide of Dwayne Anderson Young and Ahmed Said provided sharper details. Dwayne's friends remembered him receiving a message through a dating app the night of the murders. Ahmed had been with him, laughing, enjoying their night out before everything turned dark. Detectives examined phone records, traced accounts, and soon linked the online profile to Brown. It was one of the first solid breakthroughs, evidence that tied him directly to the victims. What had begun as suspicion hardened into certainty. Ali Muhammad Brown was their killer. But certainty did not equal capture. By then, Brown had left Washington behind. He was on the move, slipping eastward, carrying his ideology like a weapon. For the families left behind, waiting for answers became unbearable. Leroy Henderson's loved ones demanded justice, struggling to understand why his life had been chosen as the opening chapter of this horror. The families of Dwayne and Ahmed mourned not only the loss of their sons but also the violence inflicted on a community that already lived with the weight of discrimination. Their names became rallying cries at vigils, faces printed on posters, candles lit against the dark. And yet, the man responsible had disappeared, as if mocking the grief he had caused. Then came the killing of Brendan Tevlin in West Orange, New Jersey. Brendan was not part of the same community as the earlier victims, not connected by lifestyle or circumstance. He was chosen at random, a symbol of Brown's wider declaration of vengeance. The brutality of the murder shocked even seasoned investigators. A young college student, shot 10 times at a traffic light, his life extinguished without warning or reason. It was an execution that bore the same cold precision as the earlier murders. For authorities, the link was undeniable. The man who had terrorized Seattle had now struck across the country. The investigation stretched between states, Seattle detectives working with New Jersey police and federal agencies. The FBI became involved, recognizing that Brown's crimes were more than just murders. They were acts laced with ideology, carrying the shadow of domestic terrorism. His own words, recorded in confessions later, would make that clear. But at the time, the priority was simple: find him before he killed again. The hunt for Brown was not straightforward. He knew how to disappear, how to move through cities without leaving obvious traces. But no one can vanish completely. Small mistakes left trails. A car seen too often in one neighborhood. A card used when cash would have been safer. A glance caught by someone who recognized his face from the news. Piece by piece, authorities built the net. Meanwhile, Brown's victims remained more than names on a case file. Dwon's mother spoke about her son's brilliance. How his graduation had been a moment of pride now turned into grief. Ahmed's friends remembered his loyalty, his laugh, the way he brought life into every room. Brendan's parents recalled the boy who was not only intelligent and kind but devoted to his family. A young man whose future stretched wide open until it was cut short. Leroy's friends thought of the man who worked hard, who never asked for much, whose life had been stolen in silence. Their stories filled newspapers, memorials, and courtrooms, reminding the world that these were not just statistics. They were people, each loss rippling outward in pain. As investigators closed in, Brown remained unrepentant. To him, the murders were not crimes but missions. In his warped logic, every bullet fired was revenge for civilians killed overseas. His own life had become a battlefield, one where he alone decided who would live and who would die. When finally arrested in July 2014, after weeks of pursuit, he did not deny what he had done. Instead, he confessed openly, explaining that his killings were an act of war. He spoke calmly, without hesitation, describing his victims not as individuals but as symbols of a nation he despised. For prosecutors, his words were both chilling and significant. They transformed the case from a series of murders into something larger. This was not just about a violent man lashing out. It was about ideology driving violence on American soil. His statements allowed charges of terrorism to be considered, one of the first times such charges would be used in connection with serial killings. The legal process would take years, but even in its earliest stages, the weight of Brown's crimes became clear. He was not merely facing murder charges. He was confronting the full measure of a system determined to make an example of him. Families sat through hearings, listening to the man who had taken so much from them explain his reasoning with cold detachment. They saw in him no remorse, only conviction. For them, it was salt in an open wound. Yet even as the case built, communities tried to heal. Vigils were held not just in Seattle but also in New Jersey, where Brendan's friends and family gathered to honor his life. The LGBTQ+ community in Seattle demanded justice, not only for Dwon and Ahmed but for all who lived with fear of violence. Leroy's family spoke quietly of his absence, the hole left in their lives. Their grief was personal, but together, it created a chorus of voices calling for accountability. Brown's crimes had crossed boundaries: racial, cultural, geographical. He had targeted men from different backgrounds, united only by the fact that they lived in a country he had turned into his enemy. His actions forced people to confront uncomfortable questions: how ideology can twist into violence, how one man's belief can devastate countless lives, and how communities respond to hatred that seems to come without warning. By the end of 2014, the full scope of his violence was laid bare. For lives ended, families shattered, 2 states scarred. And yet, the story was not over. The trial awaited, and with it, the chance for the justice system to define what these murders meant, not only for the victims but for the nation itself. When Ali Muhammad Brown finally stood before the court, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and grief. For years, families had carried the weight of unanswered questions, waiting for the man who had torn through their lives to face justice. Now, in the stark walls of a courtroom, the story that had begun in the quiet streets of Seattle and ended on a road in New Jersey would come to its final chapter. Yet for many, no verdict could undo the pain already inflicted. Justice could only mark an end to Brown's freedom, not to the emptiness left behind by the lives he had taken. The trial was not ordinary because the crimes were not ordinary. Brown did not deny his actions. In fact, he spoke of them openly. He admitted to the murders of Leroy Henderson, Dwayne Anderson Young, Ahmed said, and Brendan Tevlin. His reasoning was as chilling as his deeds. He declared that each killing was part of his personal jihad, revenge for what he saw as the suffering of Muslims abroad. His words echoed through the courtroom, delivered not with the regret of a man haunted by his actions, but with the conviction of someone who believed in the twisted justification he had built around his violence. For the families sitting only a few feet away, hearing this was like reliving the murders all over again. Prosecutors moved methodically, laying out the details of each case. They walked the jury through the night Leroy Henderson was gunned down, explaining how Brown lured him into the woods, tested his will to kill, and left him there with no thought for the life he had ended. They described the deception used on Dwayne and Ahmed, how Brown preyed on trust through a dating app, drawing them into his trap before executing them with cold efficiency. And finally, they recounted the night in West Orange when Brendan Tevlin, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, stopped at a red light and was ambushed without warning. Each detail was a wound reopened, each photograph and testimony a reminder of futures erased. The defense had little room to argue innocence. Brown's own admissions had ensured that. Instead, the defense attempted to contextualize his actions within a frame of ideological obsession, painting him as someone consumed by extremist beliefs. But for the jury, and for the families, the ideology mattered little compared to the brutality of the crimes. These were not acts of war on a battlefield. They were murders deliberate, planned, and executed with chilling precision. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a place where grief and anger sat side by side. The families gave statements, their voices trembling with the weight of loss. Leroy's relatives spoke of a man whose absence left a void that could never be filled. Dwayne's mother described her pride in her son, her heartbreak at his death, and her anger at the hatred that had stolen him. Friends of Ahmed remembered his humor and loyalty, struggling to make sense of why someone so full of life had been reduced to a victim of ideology. Brendan's parents spoke with raw emotion, recalling their son's laughter, his faith, his future stolen on a summer night. Their words were not just testimony. They were reminders that behind every headline, behind every courtroom charge, were human lives, lived and loved, now cut short. When the verdict came, it was clear. Ali Muhammad Brown was found guilty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. It was a sentence designed not only to punish but to protect. For the families, it was a moment of relief, but also of permanence. Brown would be locked away, but their loved ones would not return. Justice had been served, but healing remained elusive. Beyond the courtroom, the case carried a deeper resonance. Brown's murders had been prosecuted not just as homicides, but as acts of terrorism. His words, his ideology, and his confession had transformed the legal framework. It was one of the first times that domestic killings motivated by extremist beliefs were formally treated as terrorism in the United States. The implications were significant. It meant that the justice system recognized the overlap between personal violence and ideological warfare, that the boundary between crime and terrorism could sometimes blur in devastating ways. For communities, the aftermath was layered with grief and reflection. In Seattle, the LGBTQ+ community mourned Dwayne and Ahmed, holding vigils and memorials that turned grief into resilience. Their names became symbols, reminders of the dangers faced but also of the strength to endure. For the Henderson family, Leroy's memory lived on in stories shared quietly, his life honored in the way those who loved him carried forward his spirit. In New Jersey, Brendan Tevlin's death struck like a thunderclap. His community, shocked by the randomness of his murder, united in remembrance. Friends, teachers, and fellow students spoke of his kindness, his bright mind, and the faith that defined him. His absence became a rallying cry for vigilance against violence that can come without warning. Ali Muhammad Brown remained unrepentant even after sentencing, holding firm to the beliefs that had driven his spree. In interviews and confessions, he continued to frame his actions as a form of war. But outside the prison walls, the world remembered differently. His victims were not symbols, not collateral in some imagined conflict, but people, sons, friends, brothers, whose lives mattered deeply. The contrast between his cold justifications and the warmth of the memories left behind underscored the senselessness of his campaign. The story of Brown's murders is remembered not only as a series of crimes, but as a lesson about the destructive power of hatred fueled by ideology. It revealed how one man, acting alone, could transform personal anger into violence that spanned states and communities. It showed the importance of connection between law enforcement agencies, the role of communities in demanding justice, and the resilience of families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. As years passed, the scars remained. The names of Leroy Henderson, Dwayne Anderson Young, Ahmed Said, and Brendan Tevlin lived on in memorials, in family stories, in the quiet spaces where grief lingers. Each was remembered for who they were, not how they died. Their lives became a counterpoint to the hatred that ended them, proof that love and memory endure beyond violence. In the end, Brown's crimes left a legacy of loss, but also of strength. His attempt to turn murder into a message failed, because what endured was not his ideology but the stories of his victims. They are remembered not as statistics in a case of domestic terrorism but as individuals whose lives touched many. The true story of this case is not of the man who declared his personal war, but of the 4 lives that remind us of the human cost of hate. On a warm June evening in London, Ontario, an ordinary family walk turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. Targeted for their faith, the Afzaal family's tragedy shocked an entire nation. What followed exposed hidden hatred, a historic trial, and a story Canada could never forget. The early summer of 2021 carried with it the sense of renewal. After more than a year of uncertainty brought on by the pandemic, families across Canada were beginning to reclaim pieces of their ordinary lives. Walks in the park, visits with friends, quiet moments together under the open sky. In London, Ontario, the Afzaal family had created a ritual of evening walks, a simple act of togetherness that reflected their bond. For them, it was not just exercise or routine, but a cherished time to connect away from the demands of work, study, and daily obligations. Salman Afzaal embodied the role of both father and community figure. Born in Pakistan, he had worked hard to establish himself in Canada, not only for the sake of his family's future, but as a contribution to the society he called home. Those who knew him described a man who was patient and compassionate, the kind of person who carried quiet strength. His work as a physiotherapist allowed him to heal others, and in every interaction, he left behind the impression of kindness. By his side was his wife, Madiha Salman, whose presence carried both intellect and grace. She was pursuing a PhD in civil engineering at Western University, one of the most prestigious academic paths in her field. She was a woman of ambition and vision, determined to break barriers and set an example for her children, especially her daughter Yumna. In academic circles, she was known for her brilliance. At home, she was a devoted wife and mother, balancing her dual roles with remarkable resilience. Their daughter, Yumna, at just 15, was already emerging as a young woman of promise. Bright, curious, and creative, she stood at the threshold of the future with the same drive her parents instilled in her. Friends would later recall her warmth, her laughter, and her determination to live authentically, embodying the values her family had nurtured. The matriarch of the family, 74-year-old Talat Afzaal, provided the foundation of tradition and continuity. She had seen life's hardships, yet her spirit remained soft and nurturing. Her presence in the home was a reminder of roots, of history, of the strength of family bonds. Her wisdom influenced every member of the household, her love holding them together like a thread woven tightly through generations. And then there was the youngest, only 9 years old, whose life still brimmed with innocence. His world was one of school days, small adventures, and the secure love of parents and grandparents. In him, the family saw their future, their hope, their legacy carried forward. It was this portrait of unity, of resilience, of love, that stepped out together on the evening of June 6, 2021. The streets of London seemed quiet, ordinary. The air was heavy with the warmth of summer, the kind of evening that promised nothing more than peace. But lurking in the same city was a man consumed by darkness, a man whose mind had been twisted by hate. Nathaniel Veltman was only 20 years old, but in his short life he had already been radicalized by online propaganda. Exposed to white nationalist ideologies, he had allowed fear and anger to calcify into hate. To him, Muslims were not neighbors or fellow citizens, they were targets. In private, he nursed these poisonous ideas, feeding them until they became a worldview. And on that June evening, he decided to act. As the Afzal family made their way along the sidewalk, Veltman drove his black Dodge Ram pickup truck into the same area. He was not distracted, nor was this an accident of speed or circumstance. He had already made up his mind. With chilling clarity, he accelerated, steering directly toward the family. Witnesses later described the horror of what they saw. A truck veering off the road, striking human beings with violent force, and then speeding away. The impact was catastrophic. In the space of moments, lives were extinguished, futures stolen. The serene evening walk was transformed into chaos. Passers-by rushed to the scene, but nothing could reverse the devastation that had just unfolded. Salman, Mediha, Yumna, and Tullet were gone. Only the youngest boy survived, injured, broken, but alive. His survival was both a miracle and a tragedy, for he awoke to a world without the very people who defined his existence. Meanwhile, Veltman fled, but he did not run far. Within minutes, he was arrested in the parking lot of a nearby mall. What stood out most to officers was not panic or remorse, but his unsettling composure. Wearing body armor and a helmet, he surrendered without resistance. To the authorities, he spoke with chilling frankness, admitting that he had targeted the family because of their faith. This was not a crime of impulse. It was an act of terror, calculated and executed with hate as its only motive. News of the attack spread rapidly across London, then across the nation. In a matter of hours, what began as a quiet Sunday evening became a headline that shocked the country. Families sat before televisions in disbelief. Muslims across Canada felt the weight of fear pressing down upon them, a reminder that hatred was not a distant force but one that lived among them. By the next day, vigils began to appear. Flowers laid on sidewalks, candles flickering in the night, messages written in grief and solidarity. The Afzal family's loss was no longer theirs alone. It became a symbol of the violence of Islamophobia, of the fragility of safety, of the work still unfinished in building a society free from hate. The young boy, the lone survivor, became the silent witness to all that had unfolded. His pain was unimaginable, yet his survival carried a message the world could not ignore. He was the living reminder of what had been lost, and of what must be protected for the future. In those first days after the attack, Canada was united in mourning. But behind the vigils and speeches, questions began to rise. Questions about how a young man could be so radicalized, about whether enough was being done to confront extremism, and about what it meant to live as a Muslim in a country that promised safety but delivered tragedy. The days following the attack were heavy with grief. London, Ontario, found itself at the center of national attention, not for celebration or achievement, but for a tragedy that shook the conscience of the country. The image of the Afzal family, for lives taken in an instant, one child left to carry a lifetime of loss, haunted people far beyond the city. Candlelight vigils spread across provinces, and communities that had rarely intersected stood shoulder to shoulder in mourning. Streets that once echoed with the laughter of families now carried the silence of sorrow, interrupted only by prayers and the quiet crackle of burning candles. But even as the community tried to process the enormity of what had happened, the wheels of justice began to turn. The man responsible, Nathaniel Veltman, was in custody. His arrest had been swift, his confession unsettlingly direct. He told police that he had deliberately chosen the family because they were Muslim. The gravity of those words would define the case, not just as a murder, but as something more, a hate-fueled act of terror. Investigators began to peel back the layers of Veltman's life. At just 20 years old, he was a man few had paid much attention to. He had been working in London and living alone, but online, his world looked very different. Authorities uncovered a digital trail of extremist propaganda, far-right manifestos, and messages that revealed a mind poisoned by ideology. The more they examined, the clearer it became. This was not a moment of sudden madness. This was the outcome of years of radicalization, nurtured in the hidden corners of the internet where hate breeds unchecked. Prosecutors faced a daunting task. Murder charges were certain, but there was more at stake than securing a conviction. This case was different because it carried with it the weight of defining what justice meant in the context of hate crimes. To charge Veltman only with murder would be to ignore the intent behind his actions, the ideological venom that drove him. The decision was made to add terrorism as an aggravating factor, a rare move in Canada's legal history. This would be one of the first times the country attempted to label a hate-motivated killing as an act of terrorism in court. As the legal battle formed, the personal stories of the Afzaal family became more widely known. Salman's patients shared memories of his gentle manner, his commitment to easing pain and restoring health. Madiha's colleagues spoke of her brilliance, the research she had been conducting, and the promise of what she might have achieved. Teachers and friends remembered Yumna as a teenager full of life, her potential stretching far into the future. And neighbors recalled Tullet as the soft-spoken elder who always carried kindness in her eyes. The human cost of the attack was immeasurable, and every detail added weight to the sense of injustice. In court, the presence of the surviving boy hovered over every word spoken. He was not there in person, but his story was a silent force, reminding everyone that this was not only about lives lost but also about the life that remained. His survival was both a blessing and a burden, proof of resilience but also a scar that could never fully heal. For many, the question became not only how to punish the man responsible, but how to protect the child who had been left behind. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to craft its own narrative. They hinted at mental health struggles, questioning Veltman's stability and attempting to draw attention away from ideology as the central motive. But the evidence was difficult to ignore. Witnesses had seen him accelerate. Police had heard his confession. The body armor he wore and the manifesto-like statements he made all pointed to preparation, not impulse. This was not a man who lost control. This was a man who carried out a mission. As the case unfolded, the attack resonated beyond the courtroom. Canada, a country often perceived as peaceful and inclusive, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Muslim families spoke openly about their fear, about how they now hesitated to walk together in public. The attack had not only destroyed one family, it had sent ripples of fear across an entire community. For Muslims in Canada, it was a chilling reminder that hatred could transform into violence at any moment. Political leaders addressed the nation. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared the attack an act of terrorism, a statement meant to signal solidarity and recognition of the crime's true nature. Yet, for many, words were not enough. They wanted policy, concrete steps to combat radicalization and protect communities. Calls grew louder for governments to address online hate, to regulate the platforms where extremists find their voice, and to strengthen protections for minorities. Through it all, the memory of the Afzaal family remained at the heart of the story. Their lives became symbols, not only of what was lost but of what Canada risked losing if hate was allowed to grow unchecked. They had come to Canada to build a future, to contribute, to belong. In their daily lives, they had done everything right. Worked hard, studied, cared for others, embraced the opportunities of a new home. And yet, they were struck down by someone who saw only their faith, who reduced them to a target defined by hate. The trial became more than a pursuit of justice for one family. It became a measure of how a nation responds to hate within its borders. Could Canada, with its reputation for diversity and inclusion, rise to the challenge of recognizing that extremism was not just an imported problem, but one that existed at home? Could it set an example by holding Veltman accountable not just as a murderer, but as a terrorist? For months, the courtroom became a place where those questions were tested. Witnesses recounted the horror of that June evening. Experts explained the pathways of radicalization, and prosecutors laid out a case built on motive as much as action. Every word spoken was shadowed by the absence of Salman, Madiha, Yumna, and Tullet, and by the presence of the young survivor, whose silence carried the loudest testimony of all. As the proceedings continued, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not simply a trial of a man, but a trial of ideology, of hate itself. And the outcome would carry implications far beyond London, Ontario. As the trial entered its final phase, the air in the courtroom was heavy with expectation. Every testimony, every exhibit, every cross-examination had built toward this moment. The community waited, torn between grief and a yearning for justice. For the Afzaal family, justice could never mean restoration. Their loved ones were gone forever, but it could serve as recognition, an acknowledgement by the law and the country that this crime was not just murder. It was terrorism born of hate, and it had to be named as such. The prosecution's arguments were clear and unwavering. They presented Nathaniel Veltman not as a confused young man overcome by impulse, but as a calculating extremist. They outlined his online activities, his attraction to white nationalist propaganda, his deliberate choice to target Muslims. They described how he had equipped himself with body armor and a helmet before the attack, how he confessed openly afterward that his actions were driven by ideology. This was not an accident. It was a mission of hate carried out with chilling purpose. The defense attempted to paint a different picture. They spoke of Veltman's mental health struggles, of his isolation, of the pressure he felt as a young man living alone. They argued that his choices were clouded, that perhaps he was not entirely in control of his actions. But those arguments seemed small in the face of the devastation. For lives had been lost, a child's world shattered, and the community scarred. Excuses could not erase the evidence of intent. When the jury deliberated, the country held its breath. For many, this trial had become symbolic of how Canada would define itself in the face of extremist violence. Would it recognize Islamophobia as a deadly force? Would it confront the uncomfortable truth that hate could exist not just in distant places, but in Canadian neighborhoods, carried by young men like Veltman? The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Nathaniel Veltman was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. More than that, the court recognized the ideological motive behind the killings, affirming that this was an act of terrorism. The decision was historic. Canada had rarely, if ever, seen a crime of this nature prosecuted in such a way. The label mattered. It was a declaration that hate-fueled violence would not be minimized, that the loss of the Afzaal family would not be treated as ordinary crime. It was terrorism, and the law would treat it as such. For the Muslim community, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served in a courtroom, but it could not erase the fear that had seeped into their lives. Families spoke of changing routines, of looking over their shoulders during evening walks, of hesitating before sending their children out in traditional clothing. The attack had planted seeds of anxiety that could not easily be uprooted. But at the same time, the recognition of their pain, the acknowledgement of the hate behind the crime, brought some measure of validation. Their grief had been seen, their voices heard. Beyond the legal outcome, the tragedy sparked a broader reckoning across Canada. Politicians, educators, and community leaders began to address Islamophobia with new urgency. Policies were debated, initiatives launched, and conversations about online radicalization grew louder. Vigils turned into marches, and marches into campaigns for awareness and change. The memory of the Afzaal family became a rallying point, a call to action that reached beyond London and into the heart of the nation. The young boy who survived remained at the center of it all, though shielded from the public as much as possible. His story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had endured injuries, both physical and emotional, that no child should ever bear. Yet he also became a symbol of resilience, a living reminder of what hatred had tried and failed to destroy. Communities rallied to support him, raising funds, offering care, and promising that he would not be alone in the years ahead. His future, though forever marked by tragedy, was held up as a reason to keep fighting against hate. In the years that followed, the attack continued to shape Canada's national conscience. The Afzaal family's names were spoken in schools, at memorials, in government debates. Their story became a lesson in both the dangers of extremism and the enduring power of community. Their lives, though cut short, were remembered not only for the way they ended, but for the love, brilliance, and humanity they represented. Salman's compassion as a healer, Medihis' brilliance as a scholar, Yumna's bright promise, Tullet's gentle wisdom, all became part of a collective memory that Canadians vowed not to forget. But perhaps the greatest legacy lay in the unity that followed. In the face of hate, communities came together with renewed determination. Muslims and non-Muslims stood side by side, not just in mourning, but in commitment to building a safer, more inclusive future. The attack had been meant to divide, to instill fear, to make a family into a target. Instead, it sparked solidarity, ignited conversations about equality, and reminded people of the fragility of peace and the importance of protecting it. For Canada, the Afzal family's story is now a permanent chapter in its history. It is a reminder that hate is not abstract but real, that it can manifest in the most ordinary places, and that it must be confronted with courage and clarity. It is also a reminder of resilience, of a child who survived, of communities that refused to be silenced, and of a nation still striving to live up to its ideals of diversity and inclusion. As the final gavel fell in the courtroom, the story of the Afzal family did not end. It continued in the prayers whispered at vigils, in the policies debated in Parliament, in the lessons taught to children about tolerance and love. Their memory became more than grief, it became a call to action, urging a country to never again allow hate to drive a truck onto a sidewalk, to never again allow ideology to rob children of their parents, to never again ignore the warning signs of extremism. The tragedy of June 6, 2021, will always be remembered as one of the darkest nights in Canadian history. But within that darkness, the light of the Afzal family's memory endures, guiding the path toward a future where love outshines hate, and where their loss fuels a resolve for change that will echo for generations. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of every testimony and every piece of evidence hung over the courtroom like a heavy cloud. For weeks, the prosecution had built its case, weaving together the details of a crime that was not just brutal, but deliberate, motivated by ideology and executed with intent. On the other side, the defense attempted to chip away, suggesting that Nathaniel Veltman's state of mind was fractured, that mental health struggles clouded his judgment, that perhaps he was less in control than he appeared. Yet the facts were stubborn and they told a different story. The jury had listened to witnesses describe the horror of that June evening. They had heard from police officers who spoke of Veltman's calm confession, his acknowledgement that he had chosen his targets because they were Muslim. They had seen evidence of the body armor he wore, the helmet he carried, the writings that revealed a fascination with extremist propaganda. It was not the portrait of a confused young man. It was the portrait of someone who had prepared himself for a mission, one rooted in hate. In the courtroom, the Afzal family's absence was palpable. Their faces looked out from photographs presented as exhibits. Salman's quiet strength, Medihis' brilliance, Yumna's vibrant smile, Tullet's gentle presence. The surviving boy was not there, shielded from the trial for his protection, but his story echoed in every corner of the proceedings. He had survived what no child should ever endure, and his silence spoke volumes. He was the living testimony of what had been lost. When the verdict was read, the tension broke. Guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty of 1 count of attempted murder. Recognized as an act of terrorism. For many in the community, it was the outcome they had prayed for. Not because it brought back what was lost, but because it named the crime for what it truly was. It was not random violence, not mere madness, it was terrorism born of Islamophobia and fueled by white nationalist ideology. For the first time in Canada's history, a crime of this nature had been officially judged through the lens of terrorism, and that recognition mattered. Across the country, reactions poured in. Muslim families expressed a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but could it erase the anxiety that had taken root in their lives? Parents still worried about letting their children walk together at night. Women in hijabs still felt the stares of strangers, wondering if safety was ever truly guaranteed. The verdict provided accountability, but healing would take years. For the Afzal family's friends and colleagues, the loss remained deeply personal. Salman's patients still remembered his kindness, the way he treated not just injuries but people. Medihis' academic peers mourned the research that would never be completed, the contributions she would never make. Yumna's classmates grieved the dreams that ended too soon, and Tullet's neighbors felt the absence of her warmth, her wisdom, her steady presence. The verdict did not fill the void left in their lives. It only acknowledged that the void existed because of hate. Beyond individual grief, the case reshaped national conversations. Political leaders spoke about the urgent need to confront Islamophobia, to recognize it not as isolated prejudice but as a systemic problem that could lead to violence. Calls grew louder for legislation to combat online hate, for stronger protections for marginalized communities, for education that dismantled stereotypes before they hardened into ideology. The attack had opened wounds, but it had also opened eyes. The surviving boy remained a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Though his name was kept private, his existence carried enormous weight. Communities rallied to support him, raising funds to secure his future, promising that he would not walk alone. His survival was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, life endured. Yet it was also a reminder of the cruelty of hate, for his future would always carry the shadow of what had been taken from him. Over time, memorials were built. The Afzal family's names were etched into public memory, their story told in schools, at vigils, in speeches. What had been intended as an act of terror, designed to instill fear and division, instead became a story of resilience and unity. The family's lives, though cut short, became a legacy, an ongoing reminder that communities must stand guard against hate, that silence in the face of extremism can never be an option. The verdict marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story. The work of building trust, of creating safety, of ensuring that the Afzal's deaths were not in vain, continued. It was work that extended beyond the courtroom, into classrooms, neighborhoods, governments, and hearts. Canadians were left with a choice: to let the tragedy fade into memory, or to let it shape a stronger, more inclusive future. For many, the answer was clear. The Afzal family's memory would not be defined by the hatred that took them, but by the love they gave, the promise they carried, and the unity they inspired. Their story became a call to confront hate wherever it lived, to protect every child's right to walk safely with their family, to ensure that no community ever again bore the weight of such tragedy. And so, as the gavel struck for the final time, Canada did not close the book. It carried the story forward, a permanent reminder that hate must be challenged, love must be defended, and the lives lost on that June evening must never be forgotten.